We've now seen a couple ways to trigger GET requests in a browser. We can either include an anchor with an href attribute that lists another page on our site or another site, or we can include a form whose method attribute has the value GET. In the first case, a user clicking on the anchor will trigger an HTTP GET request to the URL listed in the href attribute. In the second case, submitting the form will result in an HTTP GET request to the URL listed in the action attribute. All this is great, but what about post requests? What about those times when we want to update a resource on the server, like adding a new contact or editing a current one? It turns out that the change in HTML is fairly trivial, and what the browser does with the data is fully in line with how data is meant to be transferred in a post request, according to the HTTP specs. Let's look at an example on httpbin.org to see a post request in action. In Chrome with Developer Tools open, I'll navigate to httpbin.org. Now, if you scroll down, you'll see a link to /forms/post. Go ahead and click on that. In this form, we have some other input types such as radio buttons, checkboxes, here's a time field, and even a text area. One thing remains the same though. All of these elements have name attributes, and the values will be determined by what the user fills in. And I can see that that's the case if I inspect one of these elements. I'll expand the label element there to reveal the underlying input whose name has a value of topping, and the value that's passed when the form is submitted will be determined by whether or not the user has checked this box. I can take a peek at some of the other input elements if I inspect those as well, just to verify all their name attributes. There we have a cust name standing for customer name. I'll click on that one. The name there is custel, standing for customer telephone. And then finally, the email address, whose name is cust email. Now, if you scroll up, what you'll notice if you check the opening tag is that the method attribute has a value of post. This is exactly what we would expect from a post form. Also notice the action attribute has a value of /post. That is the relative URL where the HTTP request will be sent when this form is submitted. That is a relative URL, which means this is relative to the domain name. It starts with /, which means it's relative to the domain, the full URL for which would be httpbin.org/post. Let's fill in some information in this form to examine the HTTP request that happens when we submit the form. So I'll just drop in whatever information I feel like. I'll take a medium pizza with onions and mushrooms. I want that right at noon. Very hungry at lunch. And I would like it delivered directly to my mouth. Okay, and let's go ahead and submit that order to see the HTTP request that was sent. Now, I'm going to, for now, ignore the results in the viewport up above because we are going to focus on the HTTP request. Now remember, that appears in the Network tab. Let's drag this panel up a little bit to give ourselves some more room, and I'll click on that post request to reveal the request headers. And if you click View Source, you can view the raw request headers that were sent exactly as they appear in the HTTP request. First, you see that the request method is indeed post as opposed to get, and here's our host, httpbin.org. Also worth noting here is the content length header of 193. Remember, that's measured in bytes, and that's the length of the data that was included in the payload. The payload is simply the query string of data sent. In Chrome Developer Tools, you'll find the payload of a post request in the form data section. So I'll scroll down to the bottom, and here's the form data section. If you'd like to see the raw form data that was sent, you can, again, choose View Source, and you'll see the query string version of that data that was submitted with the request. Now, you might see some characters in here that you didn't actually enter that are included in the values of the form data. For example, this %40, we've got a %3a here. What those are URL encoded characters, and they allow a browser to use a special sequence of characters starting with a %sign that make the query string safe to transfer in a URL. For example, this %40 is the URL encoded version of the @ sign, and this %3a is the URL encoded version of the colon sign. Check the teacher's notes for a reference of URL encoded characters. Now, in a POST request, the data isn't sent through the URI like it is in a GET request, but the same approach is used in constructing a query string regardless of whether they're being transferred with GET or POST requests. That is, the name-value pairs are separated by ampersands, and for each parameter name-value pair, the name is separated from its value with an equal sign. If you want to verify the content length, copy the entire query string and paste it into a character counter website like charactercounter.com, or I'll use charcounter.com. When I paste that in there, I will see 193 characters. I'll go back to my original request, scroll up a bit to verify that my content length was indeed 193 bytes. That's 1 byte per character. The nice thing is, we didn't have to calculate that value ourselves and construct an HTTP request using that value. The browser takes care of that for us. There is one more new header that you might notice, and that is the content type header. In this request, it has the value application/xwww form URL encoded. This communicates to the server that the data has been encoded with URL safe characters. Check out the teacher's notes for some information on how this differs when a form includes a file upload field.
And there you have an example of a browser performing a POST request upon submitting a form. Just like I did with the GET form submission, let me give you an illustration of what is happening in the browser with a POST form submission. First, the browser renders the HTML for a form to present it to the user. The form contains a method and action attribute, and inside the form are various named elements giving the user a chance to provide information. After entering this information, the user submits the form, either by clicking a submit button or by pressing enter. This sets the browser into action. Using the URL in the action attribute, the browser establishes a network connection to the host, then begins to construct an HTTP POST request, since the form's method attribute is listed as POST. The form's data is put together as a query string using the name attributes as parameter names and the user-provided values as the parameter values. Since this is a POST request, your browser calculates the number of bytes in the query string and adds a content length header to the request. Then, it sticks this query string into the payload of the request after a blank line following the header section. When the browser's done constructing the request is sent over the established network connection, and when the response arrives as HTML, the browser renders the results. When compared to a GET form submission, the differences in a POST form submission are that in a POST request, content type and content length headers are required, and the query string data is included in the payload below the headers instead of in the request line above the headers.